Chapter 1. A New Beginning, an Old Shadow. The rain was relentless, pounding against the cracked windows of the small studio apartment Elena had been renting for the past 6 months. She pulled her fraying coat tighter around her shoulders as she stared at the classified section of the newspaper. The words blurred together, her vision stinging from exhaustion and unshed tears. It had been 3 years since Damien had walked out of her life without a word, and somehow her world had only crumbled further since. First, her parents' small tailoring business had gone bankrupt, leaving them in debt. Then, her job at the department store had been cut, leaving her to scrape by on temp work. But none of that compared to the ache she still felt when she thought about him, the man who had promised her a future, only to vanish without a goodbye. She hated herself for still caring, for letting his memory linger. The sound of her landlord banging on her door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Rent's due tomorrow, Elena. Last warning." His voice was sharp, the kind that sent a chill down her spine. She bit her lip and scanned the page again. That's when her eyes caught it. Domestic help needed, live-in position, high salary, must be discreet and dependable, apply at Hillcrest Manor. Her stomach twisted. Hillcrest Manor, it couldn't be, but a quick glance at the address confirmed it. The estate belonged to Damien Laurent. Elena froze, her hands trembling. She hadn't seen him since the day he vanished from her life, and the thought of facing him again made her chest tighten with both dread and defiance. But the rain continued to pour, and the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter didn't care about her pride. Desperation made the decision for her. The grandeur of Hillcrest Manor loomed before her like a ghost from her past. Its towering stone walls and manicured gardens were as intimidating as she remembered, though something about it felt colder now. Elena's heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she was led inside by a butler who barely glanced her way. She clutched her worn leather bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the single photograph she always carried, a faded snapshot of her and her sister Sophia, taken when they were children. She hadn't seen Sophia since they were separated in foster care years ago, but the memory of her smile was a small comfort on days like this. "Wait here," the butler said curtly, leaving her alone in the grand foyer. She barely had time to take in the gleaming chandelier and the cold, sterile perfection of the space when she heard footsteps. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Elena?" The voice was unmistakable, low, smooth, and edged with a hint of surprise. She turned slowly, and there he was, Damien Laurent. Time had been kind to him, she noted bitterly. He was taller, more self-assured, his sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes exactly as she remembered. But there was something different, too, an air of control, of power, that made her uneasy. "Elena," he repeated, his voice softening, though his expression remained unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," she said, lifting her chin. "But I need the job. That's all this is." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine. You'll report to the head housekeeper. You won't interact with me unless absolutely necessary. Understood?" Crystal clear. By the time her first shift began, Elena was already questioning her decision. The mansion was a labyrinth of opulence, its gleaming floors and ornate furnishings a stark contrast to the weight in her chest. Her tasks were straightforward, cleaning, organizing, keeping out of sight. It was exhausting but manageable. Yet no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, she couldn't shake the unease that came with being here. And then she saw her. The woman was standing in the sunlit drawing room, her back to Elena. She was tall, graceful, with long dark hair cascading down her back. There was a quiet elegance to her movements as she adjusted the vase of fresh flowers on the table. When the woman turned, Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her face was hauntingly familiar, large, expressive eyes, high cheekbones, and a soft smile that seemed both kind and sad. "Hello," the woman said warmly. "You must be the new maid." Elena nodded, unable to speak. "I'm Amara Laurent," she continued, holding out her hand, "Damien's wife." Elena's throat tightened. The words felt like a slap, but she forced herself to stay composed. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Laurent," she said quietly. As their hands touched briefly, Elena felt a strange sense of connection, one she couldn't explain. But as Amara turned to leave, something caught Elena's eye, a glint of gold around her neck. Hanging there, partially hidden by the fabric of her dress, was a locket. Elena's breath caught. It couldn't be. But as Amara walked away, Elena knew she had to find out. She had seen that locket before. Elena stares after Amara, her mind racing. The locket around Amara's neck was identical to the one her sister Sophia had worn the day they were separated. Could it be possible? Could Damien's new bride be her long-lost sister? Chapter 2. Meeting the Bride. Elena's thoughts raced long after her brief encounter with Amara. The locket, the delicate gold pendant she had glimpsed hanging around Amara's neck, was too much of a coincidence to ignore. It was identical to the one her sister Sophia had worn the day they were separated at the foster home so many years ago. That night, as she lay on the narrow cot in her tiny quarters at the back of the mansion, sleep was impossible. Memories from her childhood flooded her mind. Sophia's laugh as they played hide and seek, her small hand clutching Elena's tightly the last time they were together, and the promise they had made to find each other again, no matter what. Could Amara really be Sophia? Or was her imagination playing cruel tricks on her? Elena clenched her fists. She needed answers. The next morning, Elena was tasked with setting up breakfast in the sunlit conservatory. She had hoped to avoid Damien altogether, but his presence loomed like an invisible shadow, and the thought of Amara only heightened her tension. The conservatory was a place of contrast, bright and open, yet heavy with unspoken truths. Amara sat alone at the table, sipping tea from an ornate porcelain cup. She looked serene, but there was a sadness in her eyes that no amount of sunlight could chase away. "Elena," Amara called gently, noticing her hesitation near the doorway. "Come in. Sit with me for a moment." Elena froze. She wasn't sure if this was an invitation or a command, but either way, refusing didn't seem like an option. Slowly, she approached, her heart thundering in her chest. Amara gestured to the chair across from her. "You don't have to stand all the time, you know. I won't bite." Her soft laugh carried a warmth that eased some of Elena's nerves. "I appreciate the kindness, Mrs. Laurent," Elena said carefully, sitting as instructed. "Please call me Amara," she insisted. "Titles like that feel so formal, don't you think?" Elena managed a faint smile. "Amara, then." As they spoke, Elena found herself studying Amara more closely. There were subtle things, little quirks like the way she tilted her head when listening or the faint dimple in her left cheek when she smiled. They were painfully familiar, stirring memories of her sister in a way that made her chest ache. Their conversation drifted to small talk, the estate's sprawling gardens, Amara's love of art, and her recent efforts to redecorate parts of the mansion. But beneath the polite pleasantries, Elena noticed something else, an undercurrent of unease in Amara's tone whenever she mentioned Damien. "Did Damien hire you himself?" Amara asked suddenly, catching Elena off guard. Elena hesitated. "Yes, but I needed the job. I didn't realize this was your home until I arrived." Amara's eyes softened. "It must be difficult being so far from home," she said quietly. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but her gaze fell on the locket again, now glinting faintly in the morning light. Her words faltered. "That's a beautiful locket," she said carefully. "If you don't mind me asking, where did you get it?" Amara's hand instinctively moved to touch the pendant. She smiled, though the gesture seemed wistful. "It was with me when I was adopted. The family who took me in said it was the only thing I had when they found me." Elena's breath caught. "Do you know anything about where you came from?" Amara shook her head, her smile faltering. "Not much. I was very young, maybe 5 or 6. I don't remember anything before the adoption, really. Just flashes. A girl's voice, holding someone's hand, but it's all so blurry." Elena's throat tightened. Could it really be her? "I'm sorry," Amara said suddenly, mistaking Elena's silence for discomfort. "That's probably more than you wanted to hear. I don't usually talk about these things." "No, it's fine," Elena said quickly, her voice shaking slightly. It's important to remember where we came from." The sound of Damien's voice interrupted them, cutting through the fragile moment like a knife. "Amara," he called from the doorway, his tone clipped. "We're due in town shortly. Don't forget." Amara stiffened. The light in her eyes dimmed as she nodded obediently. "Of course, Damien. I'll be ready in a moment." Damien's gaze shifted to Elena, cold and sharp. "You're needed in the kitchens. Now." Elena rose quickly, lowering her gaze to avoid meeting his. "Yes, sir." As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her, a weight she couldn't shake. Later that day, as Elena scrubbed the kitchen floor, her mind replayed every word Amara had said. The locket, the memories of a girl's voice, the adoption. It was too much to ignore. But if Amara truly was Sophia, how had she ended up here, married to Damien? Elena wiped her brow, her resolve hardening. She couldn't leave things as they were. If there was even a chance that Amara was her sister, she had to know for certain. But how could she tell her? And more importantly, would Amara believe her? That night, Elena sneaked into the library, searching for anything that might shed light on Amara's past. As she scanned the shelves, her eyes fell on an ornate box tucked behind a row of books. Opening it, she found a bundle of old documents, birth certificates, legal papers, and among them, a faded photograph. Her heart stopped. It was a picture of two little girls holding hands, one of them unmistakably Amara. The other was Elena. Chapter 3. The Locket's Secret. Elena couldn't stop staring at the photograph in her trembling hands. The image was faded with age, but the two girls were unmistakable. One was herself, with her wide eyes and a gap-toothed smile. The other, with her dark curls and matching locket, was Sophia, or rather, Amara. The weight of the discovery pressed against Elena's chest, leaving her breathless. She had dreamed of this moment for years, finding Sophia, knowing she was alive, but she never imagined it would be here in Damien's mansion under such strange and painful circumstances. But as relief flooded her, so did unease. Why hadn't Amara recognized her, and what was Damien's role in all of this? Her instincts told her to tread carefully. The same man who had once broken her heart was now entangled with her long-lost sister, and Elena wasn't sure she could trust him, or anyone. The next morning, Elena found herself standing in the doorway of the drawing room, where Amara was arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow on her delicate features. Elena's grip on the photograph tightened. She had spent the entire night debating whether to tell Amara the truth. Every time she thought of how much they had lost, how many years they had been apart, her resolve grew stronger. "Amara?" Elena said hesitantly, stepping into the room. Amara looked up, her expression softening into a smile. "Elena, good morning." Elena swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "Can I talk to you about something important?" Amara tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Of course. What's on your mind?" For a moment, Elena faltered. How could she explain something so unbelievable? But then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph. "I found this," she said, holding it out. "I think it might mean something to you." Amara took the photograph carefully, her brow furrowing as she examined it. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint rustle of the trees outside. "Elena." Amara's voice wavered, her fingers brushing over the image. "Where did you get this?" "I found it in the library," Elena admitted. "Amara, the girl in that picture, it's you. And the other girl, it's me." Amara looked up sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" Elena stepped closer, her heart pounding. "We're sisters, Amara. I'm Elena, and you're Sophia. Don't you remember?" Amara stared at her, the photograph trembling in her hands. For a moment, it seemed like she might dismiss it entirely, but then something shifted. Her eyes clouded with emotion, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. I don't remember much," Amara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so young when I was adopted. But this picture, it feels familiar, and the locket." She reached for the pendant around her neck, her fingers trembling. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "That locket belonged to our mother. She gave us each one before we were separated." Amara's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the pendant. "I've always wondered where I came from, who I was before the adoption, but I never imagined." "It's true, Amara," Elena said gently, her voice breaking. "You're my sister. I've been searching for you ever since we were separated, and now here you are." The moment should have been joyous, but the weight of their shared past and the circumstances of their reunion hung heavy in the air. "But why didn't you say anything sooner?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with both confusion and pain. Elena hesitated. "I wasn't sure, and when I realized who you were, I didn't know how to tell you, especially with—" She trailed off, her thoughts turning to Damien. Amara's expression darkened. "With Damien, you mean?" "Yes," Elena admitted. "Amara, I don't know how much you trust him, but there's something about all of this that doesn't feel right. The fact that you don't remember your past, the way he—" She hesitated, not wanting to push too far. Amara looked away, her hands clenching in her lap. I don't know what to think anymore. Damien has been kind to me, but he's also controlling. He doesn't like when I ask questions about my past. He says it doesn't matter. Elena's stomach turned. Amara, you deserve to know the truth about everything. Before their conversation could go any further, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both women froze, their eyes darting to the door just as Damien appeared in the doorway. What's going on here? He asked, his gaze sharp as it shifted between them. Nothing, Amara said quickly, tucking the photograph out of sight. We were just talking. Damien's eyes lingered on Elena, suspicion flickering in his expression. I see, he said coolly. Elena, don't you have tasks to attend to? Elena forced herself to meet his gaze, her jaw tightening. Yes, sir. I'll get back to work. As she left the room, she could feel Damien's eyes on her, the tension thick enough to choke. That night, Elena lay awake, her mind racing. She had finally found her sister, but the man who stood between them was the same man who had betrayed her all those years ago. And now, as she pieced together the fragments of Amara's past, one thing became painfully clear. Damien knew more than he was letting on. If she wanted to protect Amara and uncover the full truth, she would have to dig deeper. Chapter 4. The Deceiver's Web. The tension in Hillcrest Manor was a living thing, coiling tighter with every passing day. Elena could feel it in the way Damien's sharp gaze followed her, in Amara's growing unease, and in the whispers of the house staff who avoided speaking too loudly or too openly. Elena hadn't confronted Damien yet, but her suspicions were mounting. The way he dismissed questions about Amara's past, his sudden reappearance in her life after years of silence, and his position between her and her sister, all of it painted a picture she didn't like. She needed to know the truth. And if Damien wasn't going to give it willingly, she'd find it herself. That evening, Elena slipped into Damien's study. The room was cavernous, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books and documents. It smelled of polished wood and faintly of cigar smoke, a space that exuded power and control. Her heart pounded as she searched through his desk drawers, careful to leave everything exactly as she found it. Papers, contracts, and ledgers passed through her hands, but nothing that explained why Amara's past had been kept from her, or why Damien seemed so intent on controlling it. Finally, in the bottom drawer, she found a locked box. Her pulse quickened. It was heavy, its surface intricately carved with swirling patterns. She tugged at the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration burned in her chest. Elena. The voice behind her froze her in place. Slowly, she turned to see Damien standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression cold as stone. What are you doing in here? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Elena's mind raced for an excuse, but she knew there was no use lying. Looking for answers, she said finally, meeting his gaze. About Amara. About why she doesn't remember her past. Damien stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. You're overstepping, he said evenly, though there was a hard edge to his tone. Whatever Amara's past may be, it's irrelevant now. She's happy here. That's all that matters. Happy? Elena shot back, her voice trembling with anger. She doesn't even know who she is, Damien, and you're the one keeping it from her, aren't you? His jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Elena's voice rose. I know you've been lying to her, to both of us. Why? What are you so afraid of? For a moment, Damien said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped back, his gaze turning icy. You have no idea what you're meddling in, he said. Stay out of it, Elena, for your own good. The confrontation left Elena shaken, but more determined than ever. She knew now, beyond a doubt, that Damien was hiding something. Something big. And if he thought his threats would scare her away, he was wrong. The next morning, she sought out Amara in the garden, where she often went to paint. The sunlight dappled through the trees as Amara worked on a canvas, her brushstrokes calm but her expression distant. Amara, Elena said softly, sitting beside her. I need to tell you something. Amara looked up, setting her brush down. What is it? Elena hesitated. She didn't want to overwhelm her sister, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. Damien isn't being honest with you, she said carefully, about your past, about us. Amara's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I think he knows more than he's letting on, Elena said. He doesn't want you to remember where you came from. I don't know why, but... She trailed off, unsure how to phrase her growing suspicion. Amara's shoulders sagged. I felt it too, she admitted. He's always been protective, but sometimes it feels like more than that, like he's afraid of something. Elena reached for her hand. You deserve to know the truth, Amara, about your life before all of this, about who you really are. Amara's grip tightened on hers, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But how do we find the truth when Damien controls everything? Later that night, the two sisters met in secret to search the mansion for more clues. Amara, emboldened by Elena's determination, led her to a small, rarely used room near the back of the house. I've seen Damien come here a few times, Amara whispered as they entered. The room was dusty and filled with boxes and trunks, its air thick with the smell of neglect. They began to sift through the contents, their hands trembling as they uncovered old documents, photographs, and letters. Finally, Amara pulled out a small, weathered journal. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages inside were filled with faded handwriting. As they flipped through the entries, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The journal belonged to a man named Laurent, the very man who had adopted Amara. It detailed his dealings with various orphanages, including bribes and falsified records to acquire children for wealthy families. Amara, Elena said, her voice trembling, this is how they took you. Amara stared at the journal, her hands shaking. I was sold, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Elena pulled her into a tight embrace. You were stolen, she said fiercely. You were stolen from me, and Damien knew. He had to have known. As the sisters held each other, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Elena, Damien's voice called, cold and sharp. What are you doing in there? The sisters froze, the journal clutched between them. They had found the truth, but now they had to face the man who had kept it hidden.